9:30, and so I resume the hearing. First of all, could I ask Carol to give us the housekeeping announcements for today, please?
Morning. There's no scheduled fire alarm tests during the examination, so if the alarm does sound, please make your way to the nearest exit and gather on the corner of Claremont Terrace outside the J&B building, which is just to your left as you go out to the main door. Do not stop to retrieve any belongings, but exit the building as quickly and as safely as possible following the green exit routes. Do not enter the building until a fire marshal or a member of the fire service tells you it's safe to do so. Please use only the main doors to access and exit the building, and for security purposes, do not use the side doors unless you are a wheelchair user and someone is available to unlock and relock the door after you. Just to also make you aware, there are other people in the building as they're having language classes, so that you may see other people knocking about. The toilets are situated on the ground floor in the corridor adjacent to the main room, which is down the back there. Drinking water is available in the main hall for attendees, and anybody who's up in the gallery, I don't know if we've got anybody today, there is water in the foyer. There are other refreshments available in Gilligate. There's coffee shops and also a Sainsbury's Express in Bootham. Just to remind you that the session is being filmed, so if anybody has any issues, if you could just let me know, I can seat you in a place where you don't get picked up on camera. There is Wi-Fi, it's Citadel Guest, and the password is General Booth 1883, and the details are on the posters either side of the building. Right, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Carol. Looking around the table, I think most people at least have form in terms of attending the hearing, so I don't think that there's any particular need for me to explain the format or what you need to do, but I think it would be helpful to have brief introductions before we start, as tradition has it, starting with the Council's side. Mr. Alvin.
Sir, good morning. Matthew Henderson of Council and Mr. David Alvin, Queen's Counsel to my left, on behalf of the City of York Council.
Good morning, Laura Bartle, City Council, Principal Planner.
Good morning, I'm Nigel Moore from Opinion Research Services. I'm Head of Housing Assessments.
Good morning, I'm Michael Jones, Head of Housing Delivery and Asset Management at City of York Council.
Good morning, Neil Jones, please, representing British Sugar.
Morning again, sir. Matt Waters, Osborne Wickham Derwent Ward.
Good morning, Stephen Pitton. I'm a trustee of the York Travellers Trust.
Michael Hargreaves, Independent Planning Consultant, Advisor to York Traveller Trust.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good morning and welcome to our day dedicated to Matter 9, being the topic of gypsies and travellers and travelling show people. So what I'm going to do today is to divide the issues up quite simply for the purposes of our discussion. And that is, first of all, to talk about need, and the robustness of the GTAA. I think we can all use that shorthand and know what we mean. And then to move on to the question of supply in terms of quantity, and I know also that there will be points about the appropriateness of the supply identified. So that's how I'm going to do it. So if I can ask first of all that we confine ourselves to the question of need, as it is on the Council's evidence set out in the Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Assessment, and my understanding is that the Council now relies on the GTAA of June 2022.
Correct.
What I'm going to ask, first of all, is for the Council, and probably for Mr. Moore, I've no doubt, to take us through the GTAA, to give us a brief explanation of the methodology, just so that I'm absolutely clear about that, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, sir. I'll make some brief introductory remarks before Mr Moore does that. You have, of course, the June 2022 GTA, but what you also have, importantly, within the vast array of documents is the 2014 version and the 2017 version. And they are important context. This is not a council that is coming to this fresh, with only one GTAA produced very shortly before examination. What we actually have is a series of assessments going back quite some period of years now, and that allows us to build up a picture and to have greater clarity on the needs in our area. The latest one is the GTA 2022, the one on which the council relies, as you've said. We've referred to this variously as a refresh or an update, but to all intents and purposes it is a full GTAA, and Mr Moore will touch on that in a moment. It contains all of the essential components that a full GTAA does. The headline conclusions, you have page 8, figure 1, and then figure 2 below that. And I hope the hard copy made its way to you. It did. So figure 1, the need, you get that, I stress, for the whole of the plan period, and then figure 2 below that, looking at the 5-year periods thereafter. So they are the headline conclusions. Now, I'll get Mr Moore to explain in sort of short summary what is actually in section 3 of this report, and then I'll come back on a couple of specific points thereafter on methodology. So Mr Moore, do you want to, well, firstly, can you confirm how widely used this methodology is, and then secondly, can you summarise it for the inspector, please?
Yes, this methodology has been used by a very large number of local authorities. It's been developed actually over about 17 years. I began working for the company in 2005, and we began doing Gypsy and traveller assessments almost as soon as I started working for them. I actually developed much of this methodology, and particularly we developed the methodology after planning policy for traveller sites came out in 2012. So the framework that this is set in has been around since 2012 and has been examined by literally dozens of, as part of literally dozens of local plans over that time. We then updated the methodology in 2015 when planning policy for traveller sites was updated to bring in the new definition of travelling for the new planning definition of a traveller. So someone who is travelling to seek, to support that, basically seeking income, effectively travelling for work, effectively. So we brought that definition in and brought in the changes that were necessary to identify the difference between people who travel for a livelihood and those who don't. And they have two now different streams within the planning system in terms of delivering their needs. So this is a long-developed, long-tested methodology where we consider not just how many travellers there are in an area and what their current circumstances are, but we also consider their status in terms of planning status or non-planning status. The process has evolved significantly since 2015. We were asking people prior to 2015 how many of them actually travelled. So we went back to when this was before planning status for travelling mattered. We were asking people, and very few people reported that they travelled for work. But since the time that this has now become important for planning purposes, that number has gone up over time. So that has been factored into the most recent update that we've delivered here. But the process has been fairly much standard by looking at the baseline of sites which are known to exist within a local authority. So those are recorded in the appendix of the GTAA, the ones which are known to exist in York. We try and understand the circumstances of every household on every pitch. We look for overcrowded households, households who have got children who will be looking to form, anyone who is looking to move. We incorporate anyone who is in bricks and mortar and is known to be wanting to move back to sites and to try and determine their planning status. We look at unauthorised sites and unauthorised developments to see if they are generating a need, so that if there's an unauthorised site out there and it's not going to be resolved on its current site, then it's probably going to need a new pitch or a new set of pitches somewhere else. And we also look at the need for transit sites. So we're looking at a number of encampments, how those encampments are dealt with. Are they, are there a really significant number of encampments within an area? So all of this is factored into the outputs. Do you want me to go any further?
So unless you want more on the methodology, I was going to propose to leave it there. We've got some points that we will pick up the specific criticism made. Perhaps I might take it like that. Can I deal with this in two stages? Firstly, four points of context and what we say are important points of context when you look at this assessment in York. The first, as you will have seen, is that it identifies the vast majority of gypsies and travellers who are resident within the council's area are resident on local authority sites. And there is a good reason for that. They are well-managed, safe sites, and the vast majority of residents who are on those sites are in receipt of either housing benefit or universal credit, and so are in a position where it is very unlikely that they would be able to purchase or develop a private site within the council's area. And that's the first point of context. And that's very important when we come to look at the policy response in the second part of this discussion. The second point of context is the number of applications. There is a very low, I stress very low number of applications historically in York. Miss Bartle can very quickly summarise for you what that is.
Yes, so simply that our records show that there's been no applications in the last 5 years other than an application to extend the time period on the for the Elvington Showperson site, which was in 2016.
So that's the second point of context. The third point of context is the very low number of unauthorised encampments. They've fallen progressively since 2012. Single figures in the last 3 years.
Apologies, Ms Henderson, just bear with me a moment.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, I've noted Ms Bartle's point. If you could start.
I will do. My third point says a very low number of unauthorised encampments. That number's fallen progressively since 2012. Single figures recorded by the council in the last 3 years. An average stay of 1 week. The council has investigated all of those encampments where the information is available, and they were by transient members of the Gypsy and Traveller population as part of their annual or seasonal movement patterns, not by members of the population who were looking for permanent pictures. They did not, for example, give rise to the need to issue enforcement notices and enforcement appeals, nor, as Ms Bartle's already confirmed, did they give rise to applications for planning permission to try and regularise those encampments. Then the fourth piece of context, which flows really from what I've said before, is that the number of enforcement complaints is very low. With the exception of Nairburn, which is open, and we'll come back to that in a moment, they've all been resolved without the need to issue enforcement notices, and they haven't generated, for example, planning applications to regularise unauthorised sites. So the context before you, sir, is one which demonstrates exactly what the GTAA has found, which is generally low levels of need. That's context. Now, on methodology, essentially a new subheading of the criticisms made against us, there are broadly four. The first criticism that's made against the council is the use of what's been described in the GTA as proxy interviews. A number of points to make about this. Firstly, not all the interviews were proxy interviews. There was a mixture of proxy interviews and interviews with residents.
Are you able to help me in terms of the kind of breakdown of those that were proxy interviews and those that weren't?
We don't have an exact breakdown today, sir, because Mr Moore's colleagues who undertook the interviews aren't available today. I think they're both on annual leave. But in broad terms, those interviews conducted on private sites were the ones which were, the majority of those were in person, as I understand it. And those that were on public sites, that was where a greater number of proxy interviews were undertaken using the information held by the site managers.
Forgive me, I think you were saying that in relation to private sites, the majority of the interviews were not proxy interviews.
Correct.
But that those on public sites...
There was a higher percentage of proxy interviews on those sites. I can't give you a precise figure for the reasons I've explained, but we say that that was actually an appropriate approach here. Two reasons for that. Firstly, we had good baseline data. Surveys and interviews in 2014 and 2017. And secondly, the site managers here have very good relationships with the residents and held and do hold the relevant information which ORS was seeking to obtain. And Mr. Moore can perhaps elaborate on that a little further.
Forgive me, I don't know if it's because it's been a long week, but my writing hand appears to be rather slower today.
That's okay, so I suspect it's probably me in a hurry to get home, so I apologise, but...
Yeah, so sorry, I got the point that you made about site managers having good relationships, you say, with those on their sites, but I missed the next point.
Yeah, and the other point, so, is the context in which that is. We already had information collected in 2014 and 2017 on which ORS were able to draw. And there's no allegation of proxy interviews in respect of either of those GTAAs. Mr. Moore, do you want to add anything on that point?
No, just to agree with that point, the 2017 survey was done entirely by ORS interviewers, as far as I understand.
My apologies, I can't hear you very well. Perhaps
sorry.
if you pull your microphone a bit closer.
Yeah. Okay, is that better for you? Yeah. I was just saying, the 2017 survey was done by standard interviewing process by ORS. The 2022 update
so when you say standard interview process?
Our interviewers who work for ORS went to the sites and interviewed the residents.
So that is what? Primarily not proxy interviews?
That wouldn't, as far as I'm aware, no proxy interviews.
Now, the second point that's made against us, sir, is about those members of the community that may be in bricks and mortar accommodation. I'll ask Mr. Moore to just comment on that specific criticism, please.
There isn't a really simple way to find households in bricks and mortar or to identify households in bricks and mortar. The evidence points to there are obviously some households in York in bricks and mortar, but it's a relatively low number. The most recent data that anyone's collected on this was the 2011 census, and there was just over 60 households in bricks and mortar recorded within that. To be able to identify if someone is in bricks and mortar...
Forgive me.
Oh, sorry. I'll talk more slowly.
It's my fault entirely. You were telling me about the number identified in bricks and mortar accommodation in the 2011 census. I didn't pick up the number.
You've given me time to actually identify exactly the correct number. The census identified 66 households in bricks and mortar in 2011. However, after the 15 years experience of working on these studies, the vast majority of those households are settled in bricks and mortar, quite happy to be in bricks and mortar. And there is no really simple way of making no simple way of generating a number other than interviewing people in bricks and mortar and asking them if they wish to come back onto sites. There is no other way of doing this. So it relies upon identifying households in bricks and mortar and then speaking to them, because you have to make a decision about their planning status as well, as to which stream they go into. So the 2014 and 2017 studies didn't identify significant numbers of households in bricks and mortar.
So did you say didn't identify a significant number?
No. And the 2022, there are 2 households on the waiting list in bricks and mortar. But beyond that, there is no one else gone onto the waiting list. There's no one else approached the council looking for sites to help identify land to deliver private sites. If you're looking for a pitch on the public site, you're going to have to be on the waiting list, realistically, and there is a waiting list for public sites. So unless someone comes forward and is identified, then we can't add them as a need. But this is not an unusual situation to get a relatively low number of households seeking to move.
And Mr. Moore, just on those 2 that you did identify on the waiting list, you deal with this page 33, paragraph 628 of your report. But can you just summarise for the inspector what your conclusions were in respect of those 2?
Excuse me.
Those 2 families, or 2 households, I should say.
You said page 33?
Yeah, final paragraph.
Oops, sorry. Sorry, which paragraph? 628. 628, sorry, I've gone to the wrong page. Oops. Sorry, I have problems with the computer.
Paragraph 6.28.
I think I'm probably looking... Would you mind reading that one? Because I think I've got a different paragraph.
You identify there 2 households, and then you say that you consider those to be suitably housed in bricks and mortar accommodation.
Yes, that's
Could you just explain that conclusion, please, to the inspector?
That came from feedback from the officers who deal with the households and know the households, and they identified that they were suitably housed.
Thank you very much. So that then is the second point made against us. The third point made against us, sir, is about the caravan club site at Nairburn. You'll have seen reference to that site. So that site is a lawful site which has permission for use as a caravan site. It's not restricted to members of the Gypsy and Traveller community. It is, however, subject to a number of conditions, one of which prohibits permanent residence. That has been and is currently the subject of an enforcement investigation. Where has that got to? So the most recent information received from the council is that yes, over the winter period there were Gypsies and Travellers using the site essentially on a temporary basis. Once we got past March of this year, they left the site. The most recent information from the site owner, 18th of July 2022, showed only 11 occupants with a capacity of in the region of 20 pitches. I don't have the precise number, but it's in the region of 20 pitches. And occupation being in accordance with the relevant planning conditions. Now, the allegation is made against us, well, you didn't interview those members of the Gypsy and Traveller community who may have been on that site. A number of points to be made in response on that. Firstly, all the indications on the evidence available to the council to date is that that is a transient need which is met. There may have been longer periods of occupation during the heights of the COVID pandemic, but certainly the information from the first part of this year indicates a transient need which has been met on a transient basis. So there's therefore, on the evidence that we have, no current unmet need that would have made any difference to the output of the GTAA before you. And you will note that, for example, whilst this point is raised in representations on this matter, nobody tells you any alternative figures or provides you with any detail as to who might be there that would be unmet need that's not been covered in the GTAA. And so we say the point goes absolutely nowhere. The fourth criticism made against us in respect is the more general criticism of hidden sites, the allegation that ORS have missed hidden sites. Mr. Moore, can I ask you to deal with that, please?
It is always possible that a Gypsy and Traveller site can be hidden, normally potentially a single caravan, for example. Most Gypsy and Traveller sites are very visible, and certainly from our own experience is that within a few hours of an encampment or a new development starting, it will be reported to the council as part of an enforcement action. So genuinely hidden Gypsy and Traveller sites we think are quite rare. Not impossible, but quite rare, and genuinely very rare.
And we've given you the contextual data on such reports in the council's area, so which illustrates that that rarity is particularly prevalent in York. And then the final point, sir, that's made against us is one of engagement. Now, this is a bad point. If it's pursued, I will deal with it in detail, but I will give you the headline position by the council. Firstly, the Travellers' Trust was aware that the GTA was being undertaken. They were made aware by email. Secondly, they were offered a meeting. That meeting wasn't arranged. Thirdly, yes, of course. Thirdly, I don't think it's necessarily helpful to trawl through the email, sir, about who said what and when, but we can if the point is made against us.
I'm really hoping that we don't need to go there.
Likewise, sir, and hence I haven't done it. Thirdly, though, even if the council had had a meeting, it is clear to the council that the Travellers' Trust would not have changed their position. And I say that for this reason. Because Mr. Pittman, in response to the offer of a meeting by the council, said this. He said that might make sense, but it would not constitute ORS engaging with the York Travellers' Trust. So, sir, even if we had had a meeting, you would still be hearing exactly the same criticism that's made against us today. So we say, if that point's pursued, I'll deal with it in more detail, but ultimately it's a point that goes, in my submission, nowhere. So, sir, on need, I'll leave supply for later, but on need, I think that's everything that we want to say by way of an introduction to the GTAA.
Mr. Pittman.
Yeah, I'd just like to answer that point, because that email has been quoted completely out of context. It was quoted in response to an email that was sent to us by the council saying that ORS wanted to meet with us, but 2 days in the I think the email came in, if I'm not right, 2 days before this meeting was meant to be, and it was impossible for several of us to make that meeting. And we said, all that we said was, that might be a possibility to have a meeting with someone, but it could not constitute what we think was proper engagement with the York Travellers' Trust. And I'd like to put that into the context of you, sir, inviting the council to meet with the York Travellers' Trust in 2019, and again at the end of phase 2, You asked the council specifically to meet with the York Travellers Trust, and that has never happened. We had one meeting on Zoom, and that was purely because we had asked if we could perhaps reach a ground to reach a common a statement of common ground. And we had one Zoom meeting, which eventually happened the day before the publication of the ORS report. So the idea that that could be considered for us being uncooperative, I think is completely out of the question.
Councillor Waters.
I think it's... I'd sort of attended this morning, more to observe than anything else, but I really can't listen to what Mr Henderson had said about the vast majority, Gypsies and Travellers, are on local authority sites that are well managed. That is completely untrue, certainly in the context of the Osberwick site, which I know a great deal about over many years.
Do forgive me, the what site?
Osberwick site. Sorry, sir. I don't wish to prolong your day today by going through years and years of evidence on this, but I'll just relate to the most recent, which was March and April 2021, which saw 100 tonnes of fridges and assorted scrap removed from private land at the back of that site. The site was then secured again at a cost of £50,000 to the public purse. This was after the council received Homes and Communities Agency money in 2013, I think from memory. £673,500 was granted for better site management and an increase in pitches on that site, and that has been money completely and utterly wasted. As I say, sir, if it helps, I can send a lot of this information, but whether it benefits you or not, I don't know.
Mr Hargreaves.
Oh, thank you, sir. Good morning. I'll try and address some of the points that have been made on behalf of the council in turn. Firstly, I guess in regard to ORS's standing among researchers, they have, it's fair to say, a difficult relationship with gypsy organisations and planners and lawyers who represent gypsies. I mean, having said that, I don't underestimate some of the methodological difficulties of getting accurate assessments of needs. And we'll come on to why those methodological difficulties mean that in our submission, particularly the 2020 review, is not robust and a substantial underestimate of need. But ORS tend to have a very rigid approach to their methodology. They are very, very focused on, in a way, at one level, they're good researchers because they focus on that which is certain, but they're very poor at identifying the more elusive sources of need.
What I'd like to do, Mr Hargreaves,
Sorry?
What I'd like to do is move the framing of the discussion away from it being about ORS, and rather more about the GTAA that I have in front of me.
Yeah, okay. Right. Low level of planning applications, that's been presented as equating with a lack of need. Now, it is true that there's a low level of applications, but it does not represent a low level of need. This is a bit hypothesis on my part, but I obviously have worked for Gypsy clients across the country, and it's very difficult for Gypsy people to get hold of land. And so the number of applications is very typically related to landholding conditions. So a number of areas I'm familiar with, let's say north of Cambridge out into the Fens, where there are a lot of plant nurseries, small landholdings. Over the years, it's been very, not easy, but Gypsy families have been able to acquire quite a substantial number of sites. And so there's a relationship between the landholding situation and the number of applications that come forward. My hypothesis is that the open agricultural land around York means that it's been very, very difficult for any travellers to acquire land. I don't know if you want to come in on that, Violet.
Yeah, I'm CEO of York Travellers Trust. I'm also a Romney Gypsy, and I've struggled for 5-6 years to identify land in York to live, and I've had to leave York. My parents, the same, York family, now live in Selby on private land because they can't identify land in York. So just because there isn't need there in your report doesn't mean the need doesn't exist. We've just been priced out of the area through bad policy and housing prices.
And there is, whenever Gypsy people, there are many cases I'm aware of because I'm often asked by Gypsy people I know about whether to buy a piece of land. And many cases when Gypsy people look at land, either there are extremely strong planning reasons why they shouldn't acquire it, or when it's clear that the prospective applicants are travellers, the ability to buy it falls away. So we cannot conclude that the lack of applications is indicative of need.
Yeah, sorry, can you just explain to me, Mr. Hargreaves, what you mean when the ability to buy it falls away?
Basically, often in agricultural communities, there's often I've come across a number of cases where pressure from local residents, parish councils, has then led to, or knowledge of the seller about who the prospective buyers were, has led to a withdrawal of the sale. And so the situation in York also has to be seen against a national accommodation crisis for Gypsies, right? It is the increased supply of public sites has completely dried up. You know, the number of public sites has hardly increased at all over the last 30 years. Indeed, quite a few have been sold off, and some of those sold off have passed out of have no longer become accessible to Gypsy people. It's very, very difficult for Gypsy people, A, to acquire land, and when they do, to then get planning permission. All the additional pitches that have been developed effectively over the last 30 years are by the energies of individual Gypsy applicants. But what we have is a national crisis, and we'll come on to some of the implications of that. Then, moving on to this point about proxy interviews, I think we were told that most of the interviews in relation to the 3 council sites were effectively proxy interviews, and that the ones on private sites were face-to-face interviews. Maybe I've got this wrong, but my reading of the 2022 needs assessment is that no interviews were completed on any of the private sites. I think I would be...
I'm sorry, which paragraph are you referring to in the GTAA when you make that statement?
Oh, sorry, I would have to look it up. Let me come back to you on that one, the exact reference, okay? I'll come back on that if I may. But I think I'm correct, sorry I'm dealing with this from memory, that no interviews were completed on the small number of private sites.
I'd actually like to clarify that just before we move on.
Mr. Moore, you have the answer on that?
Yes. The interviewers from ORS attended the private sites on June the 7th. One of the private sites was found to be occupied by non-travellers, the other was...
So if you just bear with me a moment while my writing hand catches up once again. Attended private sites in June this year,
June 7th,
you said?
yes.
We don't accept the assertion you just made without reference to the actual paragraph in the GTAA.
So they attended the private sites. One was found to be occupied by non-travellers, who were self-identified as non-travellers. The other one had no one resident at that point. So,
I'm really sorry, I didn't hear you then at all.
Sorry.
Yeah, look,
I've got to speak properly.
Right, so
it's my fault.
These microphones, just so everyone knows, are a little bit sensitive. A little bit of movement makes a significant difference.
Okay. Bring towards me. That felt like it's hearing.
And also, it also doesn't help if someone's still got their microphone on.
Yes. So just to summarise that point, the interviewers came to the private sites on June the 7th. One site was occupied by non-travellers. The other one had no one there at that particular day. So they left a card to say if they wanted to take part in the survey, could they call back?
The reference is figure 6 on chapter 5. On my printed copy, that's page 30, and it says that there were no interviews on any of the private sites.
I'm sorry, could you just give that page number again, please?
Yeah, it printed out difficultly for me, but it's on page 30 on in my copy. It's the first page of paragraphs of chapter 5 of the report.
I think it might be page 28. Figure 6. And which part of figure 6 do you rely on?
Under the column interviews.
Right. In private sites, and you see exactly, sir, what has just been explained to you by Mr. Moore. 2 no contact, 2 non-travellers.
Yeah. I mean, if I could summarise that, sir, we were led to believe there was one approach on the public sites and one on the private sites. In reality, no interviews were conducted on private sites. That's important. So what we have is a survey restricted to the 3 local authority sites. And we're then told that the majority of those interviews were proxy interviews. Now, I'd make 2 points about that. One is, who are the proxy interviews by? Council staff, overwhelmingly. One of the things I understand about Gypsy people is that they are quite private and would be reticent, very reticent, about giving information about neighbours. So when...
Sorry, if I could just hold you there just for one moment to come back to the point. So I think the council said that today it's not able to provide any detail in relation to the precise sort of breakdown of proxy and non-proxy interviews in relation to the public sites. What is the council able to tell me anything about who the proxy interviews that were actually held with?
Yeah, Mr. Moore can help you with that, sir.
Yes, they predominantly came through the site managers.
And Mr. Moore, can you confirm?
Yeah.
Did you get all the information you needed? Were these site managers who didn't know what was going on, or were these site managers who gave you the answers to the questions that you were needed to ask?
We got the information we required on, ultimately the absolute key information is the households who are living on every pitch, and an indication of the travelling status of those households. And obviously the managers know within reason who comes and who doesn't come, who works, who doesn't work.
And can you just explain how you were able to use that information with the information that you already held from 2014 and 2017? What picture were you able to build?
Yes, we had a background picture on who was living on the sites, the same sites in 2017. In many cases, it is the same households who are living there. People don't move that much within public sites quite often. But it also provided us just with extra information on the households who weren't interviewed in 2017.
Sorry, I think, correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think the last point that you just made was that it was predominantly the same people that were noted to be present in 2017. Is that right?
Yeah, many of them were the same. Again, I couldn't. It's not all, but obviously many of the people don't move within public sites. So their circumstances change over time, obviously, so we just brought that information up to date.
Mr. Hargreaves, I asked you to pause. You may now unpause.
Right. Yes. I suppose I was making an observation, in fact, the other question we'd like to ask is not only how many were proxy interviews, how many were carried out by council staff, how many were provided by family members or neighbours. I then was making the point, and this is just sort of based on my experience of working with Gypsy people, that Gypsy people are private, and they are very reticent. They would, in my experience, be very reticent to provide information about neighbours to a public agency or a research firm. So we conclude, that points to the conclusion, I'll carry on and then ask Violet to come in, that most, if not all, the interviews were based on data provided by council staff.
Sorry, Mr. Hargreaves, a question for you just on that point, and I understand what you say about Gypsy people being private people, you say, and the reticence that a neighbour would have in terms of giving information to someone interviewing them about a neighbour. Does that mean then that it's better to do a proxy interview with a site manager?
I think that's an interesting question, sir, right?
I thought so.
No. At one level, yes, right? On the other, reflecting that privacy, people will only tend to... come in, Violet, if you think what I'm saying about your community is wrong. In my experience, people will only share on a kind of need-to-know basis. And particularly, one of the issues we'll come on to is the disparity between ORS's, it was 10%, is now 30% kind of assumed proportion of people who come within the definition. Now, there's a very big disparity between that and what we find from individual appeal decisions and planning application decisions. I think I quote somewhere in my evidence that of cases I've been involved in personally where inspectors have arbitrated on the nomadic status of appellants, 86% came within the definition. Now, there are, I think, two reasons for that big disparity. One is Gypsy people don't automatically trust non-Gypsy people. And my experience is I work with families and gain their trust. And as a consequence of gaining their trust, I get a much fuller picture of how the family operates, and particularly that nomadism. Now, in that situation, I'm not a genius. Like, I and colleagues who've worked closely with a family get the opportunity to work with the family and explain why they come within the definition. If I may, sir, I don't know if this would be helpful. I could just refer you to a couple of appeal decisions where inspectors have found that. Is that too much detail?
Probably, yes.
Okay. But I could, yeah, as I say, there are a number of appeal
I don't disbelieve you, Mr. Harris.
Right. I won't set you scurrying through the back catalogue of appropriate appeal decisions, sir.
Can I just answer your direct question, please? So around who should carry out these interviews. As a person that was involved heavily with the Labour government in creating the Planning Circular 106, and a person that was involved heavily in creating the guidance around GTAAs and how they should be constructed in the very first years that they were done, I actually carried out the Yorkshire and Humber Gypsy and Travel Accommodation Assessment. I carried out the Greater Manchester Gypsy and Travel Accommodation Assessment. Didn't carry out York's because they did that separately from Yorkshire and Humber. I'm very aware of how these should be carried out, and the best guidance to say is that you use peer research. So when we carried out the Greater Manchester research, we were very aware there was a large number of travelling show people there. So we recruited travelling showmen to train as interviewers, who then went out and carried out the interviews. In my personal opinion, that's the best way of doing this work, and that's the reason why many Gypsy and travel organisations have a problem with the way in which yourselves work. That's the baseline of my opinion, in my very humble opinion. To answer surely the site manager are the best placed. They're probably a good second option. However, when we've spoken to one particular site manager who is the most in touch on the ground site manager for York, he had no awareness, and his words were, if this was something I was supposed to have done, nobody told me. I find that an incredibly interesting quote. No Gypsy or traveller person on any of the sites were aware this was happening.
So would you just bear with me?
Yeah, sorry.
Catch up once again. Yeah, my apologies. I didn't entirely get the point that you made about the site manager.
So there's one particular site manager who looks after all the local authority sites quite intensely. He's the person that everybody knows on the sites. He's the person that if you mention York Council, they mention his name. I put a status on Facebook asking who had been interviewed for this point. Nobody had. 17 responders all said, no, not us, and we weren't aware of anything. This led to people asking this person, what's this about? Why have we not been told about this research? To which he contacted us to say, we've done nothing, I don't know what you're talking about, and if it was something I was supposed to do, I'm not aware of it. I just find that an incredibly interesting point, that the person that has the most contact with the community wasn't asked to be part of the research from the council. It's also worth noting there doesn't seem to be any reference to the homeless families we have in York. There are 2 homeless households in York at present, and one that has been put out of the border into Rydale that is a York family. There's no mention of those within this.
And if I could just add to that, I mean, you know, I feel really sad that we're at this position, that we're actually having to challenge our local council on this. Our local council, where the leader and the deputy leader have just recently given a complete commitment to York being a human rights city and a universal council decision to be an anti-racist city. And yet, what I think I'd like to suggest to you, sir, is that all the evidence about need is coming from the council. You know, and you asked that we were brought into this, and we would have been willing and happy to be engaged with a process that was cooperative. But unfortunately, that has just not happened. And so the information that you're being provided from the council comes from the council and not from the community.
Are you still indicating there, Mr. Hargreaves?
Have we finished on the proxy interviews? I think we possibly have.
It depends whether you've got anything else to say about them, really, and I'll then turn to the council to see what they say in reply.
Okay. My mind's gone blank. Have you got anything else to say about the proxy interviews?
Well, I think all that I would say is that we actually feel that the last ORS study was similarly done because, again, the York Traveller Trust was excluded from the process. And
when you say the last one, do you mean the 2017?
Yes, the 2017 study as well. That we were not able to find anybody who felt that they'd been interviewed. And just to add to what Violet was saying, I mean, we haven't got the resources to go around and actually do surveys ourselves. But on our Facebook post, we had 17 people, that's a quarter of all the proposed people who should have been surveyed, who said they'd heard nothing about it. But we had none, not a single person who said that they'd been interviewed for this survey. So I think that shows, you know, and it's a very sad reflection in my view, because from any point of social justice or equality, you would expect a little bit different. And that is, you know, on the basis of us asking and asking and asking to be working with the council on this. And so I'm not speaking here with any sense of pleasure. It's just on the basis that, unfortunately, the council has failed, in my view, to really engage with the community. And I think that would come through again. And I think, you know, there may not be many occasions on which Councillor Waters and I would agree on matters relating to gypsies and travellers. But I would say that I think the point he makes about the management of the sites, I would really say too as well. And there are all sorts of historic reasons for that, because, of course, for many years, York had no sites and they were inherited from other authorities. You know, but the management of the sites has not been great. I think there's been efforts in recent years to actually improve on that, but I don't think you would argue that York sites are prime examples of well-managed gypsy sites.
Ms. Cannon.
Thank you. There's just a point as well that we're all skirting around because it's quite scary, and I don't really want to be the person that raises it. But there's a lot of
go on.
There's a lot of doubling up on York sites. There's a lot of families that have married that are now in breach of their conditions, living doubly on York sites. They are not going to put their head above the pulpit and say, yes, I need a pitch, because that would mean they would be evicted. We're not talking about that. We're not discussing that. There's a lot of doubling up on York sites.
So when you say doubling up, do you mean different households living together?
So what usually happens is a young girl gets married or a young boy gets married. He forms a new household with his wife and children. There's nowhere for him to go, so the family let him live on the same pitch. So you've got two households, possibly 7 or 8 people, sharing one bathroom and kitchen. But if they raise their head above the pulpit or they cause trouble, as it's been named by the local authority workers, they'll be put off, they'll be evicted. So it's best just to stay quiet and stay beneath the radar. Sorry, I've got one point as well on the Facebook post. So 17 responders to the Facebook post, but we've also had around 35 people in the office for the last 3 days, and none of those people were aware of the research either.
When you say 35 people, do you mean 35 Gypsy and Traveller people?
Yeah, Gypsy and Traveller people.
Okay, I'll look to... Is it related to what we've just been talking about? Okay, Councillor Waters.
Thank you, sir. Seeing as the eviction word has been mentioned, it seems a good point to challenge what Mr Henderson said earlier regarding unauthorised sites and them being largely transient, lack of enforcement notices, average of 1 week. Because of an eviction from the Osberwick site, there's been an unauthorised site on a major road into the city for 3 years and 2 months now, to which the council don't seem to have a clue what to do. I'm trying to think of this lady's title. Jane Mowat, Head of Community Safety, turned up at a meeting of Dunedin Parish Council 3 weeks ago and suggested there were 3 alternatives for the council to actually do something about this site. One of which was to encourage the occupants to move away to Bridlington. There's no room on the site they were evicted from, and there doesn't appear to be room on any other sites in York. Absolutely ludicrous situation, but again, it was a reference that needed challenging, and it just came at a good point there.
Yeah, if I can ask the council to reply to what we've just heard, that the point that Councillor Waters has just made should be a matter of fact. So I would like to know what the situation is, please. I don't know if you have that.
I think Mr Jones can
so.
provide you some information on that. So whether it's all the information is a different question. Mr Jones, do you want to help the inspector as far as you're able to?
Yeah, I'm also just in replying keen to know what the council says about the appropriateness of the timing of when the interviews were undertaken in terms of the time of year, and also on those sites where no one was available to interview and a calling card was left, what if anything has subsequently happened. You'll not be surprised to hear that I hear this quite often at examination hearings, and I am sometimes told that the people involved in conducting the interviews have made multiple attempts to return to the site to actually catch the person whilst they're present. So I'd be keen to know what's happened in that respect.
Okay, let's take that in turn. So, Mr. Jones, do you want to go first on Councillor Waters' point, so far as you're able to?
Yeah. Very aware of the case that Councillor Waters refers to. As Councillor Waters says, it came about due to an eviction from the Osbaldwick site. It has been there for a significant period of time. During that time, we've had COVID, where there were restrictions on enforcement and guidance was given to support residents as well as is possible, which is what the council have been doing through welfare checks and providing services.
Sorry, forgive me, Mr. Jones. When you say that because of COVID there were restrictions in terms of enforcement, that presumably, I mean, I don't know, it depends when during the pandemic this occurred, I suppose, but was that about enforcement officers not being able to go out and attend site and that kind of thing?
It was about not taking enforcement action to move people on. Subsequently, we're aware that the vehicles on this piece of land are not roadworthy, so the option to move them on simply, should that be what the council decide to do, isn't straightforward in this case. So we've been working with the residents of that piece of land to try and find a solution, which I expect will be brought forward in the coming months.
And Mr. Moore, whilst we're on that site, can you just explain to the inspector, was that a site that you had regard to in your GTA or which you overlooked?
We have counted a need for one unauthorised encampment, a pitch from one unauthorised encampment. No one's named the site.
My apologies.
Yeah, sorry.
Once again, I do not know what's wrong with me today. I did not catch that, Mr. Moore.
Sorry, I think
and if you'd wait for this ambulance to go past.
We have counted the need from one unauthorised encampment within the GTA, which was, it's in the undetermined category, because the interviewers went to see them on the same day as the private site and they weren't again available.
Thank you very much. So that's that point. Right, next point is doubling up. Can you deal with that, please, Mr. Moore?
So, well, just before you do, were you telling me, Mr. Moore, that this site that Councillor Waters has been mentioning has been taken into account in the GTAA, just so I'm absolutely clear?
If it's the same site we are talking about, it has,
yes.
Is
it?
There is one pitch on one unauthorised encampment that we have counted within the GTAA.
Does that sound like your site, Councillor Waters?
Thank you for letting me back in, sir. It doesn't, because there's, to my recollection, 3 caravans, numerous vehicles on this site. Just to be clear, it's public highway, it's a lay-by, so the fact that the vehicles aren't roadworthy is an offence in itself. And I cannot accept this business of the pandemic interfering with any enforcement action for the simple reason, the first time the evictees were seen in public was, from my recollection, February 2019, and they were camped out on the approach to the park and ride, Grimston Park and Ride, before they then alighted on the A166. And it was June 2019 that they first appeared on this lay-by, considerably prior to any restrictions imposed by the pandemic on enforcement action, court action and such like.
So we are... Sorry.
If you bear with me. Yeah, what I'm trying to understand clearly, Mr. Moore is telling me that in the GTAA, one pitch on one unauthorised site has been accounted for. Mr. Moore wasn't able to tell me whether it was the site that you're referring to or not. So I'm asking you, does this sound like it's your site, or are you talking about something that's a bigger site, or what?
The site in question is Noddle Hill Lay-by A166, and it seems to be considerably bigger than would be accommodated on one pitch. Or it's certainly grown to be bigger in the last 3 years and 2 months.
So, well, we're checking that, but certainly my instructions at the minute are that is the same site. I don't know, Mr. Mudge, do you want to add anything on that?
No, it's near the Osbaldwick site. It's listed as land adjacent to the site that we have counted and the site that we approached.
That's a different site, sorry. That's a different site. That's the site without planning permission. Can I just also...
I'm confused now. This has happened to me before. It's a hearing about gypsies and
well, sir, I'm afraid it's inevitable, and Mr. Councillor Waters...
And the current situation, and I do need some sort of clarity, and I wasn't quite sure. I'm still not sure whether this is the pitch that Councillor Waters is talking about or not.
Well, so we're not going to be able to give you any firmer answer on our feet now. I'm afraid when Councillor Waters pitches up and chucks this in, this is the situation we find ourselves in. We can go away and we can look at it, sir, and come back to you. I can't give you any firmer answer now.
Sorry, can I speak?
That's in just a moment. That's one way of characterising it, Ms. Henson, but at the same time, Mr. Moore's not able to confirm that either. Ms. Cannon.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that, but I just felt I needed to offer some insight. The land adjacent to Osbaldwick is an unauthorised development of a long-standing family that live on there. So that's another. I've completely forgot that they were there, to be honest with you, because it feels like it's part of the site. And the fact that they're saying that Councillor Walters just threw this up, this family have been roadside for 3 years plus. They haven't just appeared in York. They've never moved from York. They are York residents. That is the family that Mr. Jones was talking about, definitely, and we are working. I'd love to chat to you, Mr. Walters, afterwards about what we're doing to support the family. So I'll be honest, my assertion that I don't believe that you went there and found it empty is probably wrong, because we're talking about different sites. Because the roadside camp always has somebody there. They have very little movement. And just to clarify, Mr. Walters, it's the caravans that are unroadworthy, not the actual driving vehicles. They're classed as vehicles.
Councillor Waters.
If it helps, sir, I'm quite able to send you any information you wanted on this particular site, but the council should be more than aware of it after all this length of time. I really find it's disappointing that nobody, especially with responsibilities for housing, can actually speak to this.
The problem I have here is I'm hearing about sort of various sites, and I need to be clear in my mind, for reasons you'll understand, whether or not those are sites that have been taken into account in the GTAA or whether they aren't. Because if I don't know that, that leaves me with something of a problem.
So no, I entirely understand why you asked the question. We can go away and look at it. I can't give you anything further now, is the short answer on it. My point is slightly different. If the criticism is to be levelled at the GTAA, and it was done in a matter statement, like, for example, the issue of the Nairburn caravan site, we can look at that and could have looked at that, and we did look at it and turned up today with that information. So my point is not to your question, but as to if we were given warning that these were the points going to be taken against us in respect to the GTAA, we could have looked at them for you before we got here today, as we did on the one site that was raised. So just be very clear about that. But the question you raise, absolutely, we can look at that, and we can provide you that information in due course. So the other points, then, leaving that particular site.
Forgive me,
Sorry.
Mr. Henderson. So yeah, I think that there are, and correct me if I get this wrong, Ms. Cannon, 2 potential sites in question here. The one, if I can just call it the lay-by site, for want of a clearer address. And if I call the other, the land adjacent to Oswaldwick is how it's been described. I need to know whether or not that's been taken into account.
So yes, and we can look at that and come back to you in due course with some more certainty on that.
Thank you. What I want to do now is let the council finish its reply to the stuff we had earlier before we forget what that was, and then move on. And Mr. Henderson won't have forgotten that I asked a couple of questions earlier as well.
No, sir, I've got those on my list. Doubling up then, please. Mr. Moore, was that something that you considered on the sites that you looked at?
There are 7 households on the waiting list who are doubled up on existing sites seeking new pitches, and they have all been counted within the need.
So that's been taken into account, sir. The next point, Mr. Moore, your use of 30%, a suggestion that instead you should be using something in the region of 86% for your undetermined need. Your response on that, please?
Yes, I come at this kind of work as a background. I was an economic statistician, so the first thing that jumps out at me always is biased samples. And if someone has been prepared to take something to a planning appeal on the status, including the status that they are that they meet the definition of planning, then they are confident enough that they meet the definition for planning purposes. That is not a representative sample of the whole population. As I think I said in my introduction, we were asking this question before planning status became important, before it became really significant, and we were getting less than 10% of people were telling us that they travelled for work. That has now increased significantly, that it's obviously become within the community. They are aware now that this is an important issue. However, we are largely talking about public sites in York, and you're typically talking about relatively low-income households, many of whom, actually a majority of whom, are in receipt of housing benefit or universal credit to help with housing costs. And therefore, we wouldn't expect as many to be travelling for work as you would find in a planning application scenario, because they're not bringing forward private site planning applications.
And can you just explain the robustness of your 30% figure? Where do you derive that from and why do you use it, please?
The 30% is derived from thousands of surveys that we've done since 2015.